Should we go? Should we get started? Okay, thank you for coming back after lunch. This panel is called Philosophical Approaches to Flourishing. So I thought I would start with a couple of jokes about philosophy and Thoreau while people are coming in. Thoreau said, simplify. The secondary literature respectfully declined. No? Some philosophers build systems. Thoreau built a cabin. These are straight off ChatGPT. AI jokes about Thoreau. I thought it was kind of funny. Descartes doubted everything. Thoreau doubted whether you really need a dining room and a new suit. You guys are a tough crowd. Most philosophers ask how to live well. Thoreau asked why you're paying for a storage unit. All right, now we can start. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Ricketts. Gary Ricketts is an independent scholar interested in the intersection of philosophy and literature in the works of Emerson and Thoreau. He's published essays in the field, serves as co-social media coordinator for the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society, and has presented at venues including the American Literature Association, the ALA, and the Thoreau Society annual gathering. William Homestead is an interdisciplinary scholar, writer, and retired associate professor of communications. He's the author of an ecology of communication, response and responsibility in an age of eco-crisis, which came out in 2021, and Not Till We Are Lost, Thoreau, Education and Climate Crisis, which came out in 2024, and was a finalist for the Vermont Book Award in Creative Nonfiction. He's also the editor of The Active Soul, Emerson and Thoreau on Reform and Civil Disobedience, which came out last year. The Active Soul includes his 36-page introduction from abolitionism to climate justice, and I taught it in my environmental ethics class the last 2 semesters. Marc Jolley is the director of Mercer University Press and senior lecturer in philosophy and great books. He is the co-editor of the recently released Thoreau and Philosophy, which I have heard is one of the most profound and intellectually stimulating books of the decade, and is rocketing its way up the charts and fast becoming a New York Times bestseller. Josephine Doucette is a resident of North Attleboro, Massachusetts, and holds a degree in neuroscience from Barnard College. Thoreau's work has influenced her life greatly. A year ago, she abandoned her plans to pursue a PhD in neuroscience, choosing to become an environmental educator instead. She currently works for the Audubon Society of Rhode Island and has discovered a passion for teaching others about the wonders of the natural world. So Gary will be up first.
I stood up.
Oh, gotcha.
Hello, everyone. Thoreau's Tranquility, Walden and the Hellenistic Ideal of Ataraxia. My paper directly engages with and expands upon Toby J. Svoboda's critique of Pierre Hadot's essay, There Are Nowadays Professors of Philosophy, but Not Philosophers, which reads Thoreau in Walden as displaying, quote, Epicurean in Stoic traits, roughly, equally, end quote, Svoboda, a debate that I argue obscures Thoreau's philosophical eclecticism and leaves a most precise term for what he achieves conspicuously unspoken. That term is ataraxia, tranquility or unperturbedness, and it is here that Thoreau's creative reading of both Hellenistic schools converges. For the Epicurean, ataraxia is a constitutive end. For the Stoic, it is a consequence of virtue. For Thoreau, this tranquility finds its most conclusive expression beyond the pages of Walden, in the composure produced by his ascesis. Adot defines ascesis as, quote, the practice of spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises, in his sense, are not necessarily religious devotions, but disciplined practices of self-transformation, meditation, self-examination, the conscious reorientation of perception. The fruits of these exercises are most notably visible in Thoreau's dying. In Adot's nowadays essay, he identifies two Epicurean traits in Walden: Thoreau's investment in life's necessities, in the pleasure of perceiving the world through them, and his implicit critique of those who ignore what is, quote, necessary and sufficient for life, end quote. He then identifies four Stoic traits, quote, solitude, the sentiment of communion, of society with nature, a joyous acceptance of nature in manual labor, end quote. Recalling Goethe's remark about, quote, certain beings who, in their innate tendencies, are half Stoic and half Epicurean, end quote, Adot does not resolve which school predominates, casting Thoreau as, quote, a true philosopher, in contrast to mere philosophy professors, a standard Thoreau himself had already set in economy. Quote, to be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, but so to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It is to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically, end quote. Adot himself supplies the justification for extending the argument beyond Walden's pages. It is exactly Thoreau's time in the woods where, quote, the philosophical act transcends the literary work that expresses it, and this literary work cannot totally express what Thoreau has lived, end quote. Toby J. Svoboda provides a careful, nuanced challenge to Adot's dual attribution in Thoreau's Walden, Epicureanism or Stoicism. He argues that the two Epicurean traits are not uniquely Epicurean. The rational critique that Thoreau directs at John Field is equally characteristic of Stoicism, and the simplification of life is common to both schools, as well as other philosophies and religions. For Svoboda, Thoreau's actions are driven less by Epicurean hedonism than by allegiance to higher laws, placing him closer to Stoicism. The primary evidence comes from Walden's higher laws, quote, where primitive instinct is subordinate to the divine. Quote, he is actually, no. From Walden's higher laws, where primitive instinct is subordinate to the divine, quote, he is blessed who is assured that the animal is dying out in him day by day, end quote, and where Thoreau declares that, quote, nature is hard to overcome, but she must be overcome, end quote. To Svoboda, the chapter confirms that Thoreau's simplification of life serves a higher moral principle, aligning him with Stoic duty. But he acknowledges, quote, the Stoic appeals to the rational, Thoreau to the spiritual and moral, end quote. Svoboda's most revealing admission, borrowed from Rick Anthony Furtak, is that Thoreau's emotional attachment to nature makes him, quote, a kind of neo-Stoic, end quote, an irresolution so complete that even his own title's disjunction, Stoicism or Epicureanism, gives way by his conclusion to the admission that, quote, Thoreau's school of thought is significantly different from Epicureanism and Stoicism, end quote. As Svoboda himself puts it, Adot's spiritual exercises, quote, can be justified by diverse philosophical discourses, since Thoreau is more interested in the exercises than in the discourse. End quote. Early in the essay, Svoboda writes, quote, "An interesting question to ask is what Thoreau's attitude was toward his own nascent Stoicism and Epicureanism, as he does not speak about it openly in Walden," end quote. Biographical and critical commentary on Thoreau tilts toward Stoicism as the stronger of the two. Richardson reports in Henry Thoreau, A Life of the Mind, that, quote, "Ellery Channing came very near the mark when he said that Thoreau's was a natural stoicism," end quote, and further characterizes him as, quote, "the most attractive example of the ageless Stoic principle of self-trust, self-reverence, or self-reliance," end quote. Richardson also remarks that we have no knowledge that Thoreau read Marcus Aurelius, but, quote, "he read other Stoic writers, Cicero, Seneca, Persius," end quote. Thoreau himself writes, quote, "Zeno the Stoic stood in precisely the same relation to the world that I do now," end quote. By contrast, his personal reading of the Epicureans is harder to trace, but the journal references Epicurus on June 24, 1840, and Lucretius's De Rerum Natura on April 26, 1856. Thoreau additionally knew Epicurus from Diogenes Laertius's Vitae Philosophorum, where Ataraxia appears in the Pyrrhonist context in Book 9 and twice in explicitly Epicurean contexts in Book 10. Epictetus, the imperial Stoic, whose Enchiridion was on Thoreau's classical reading list from 1838 to 1839, uses Ataraxia 14 times in the Discourses and twice in the Enchiridion. Significantly, Thoreau writes in Economy that, quote, "the incessant anxiety and strain of some is a well-nigh incurable form of disease," end quote. Identifying perturbation itself, tarake, as pathology, though he never invokes Ataraxia's Greek antonym directly. The positive counterpart appears in solitude. Quote, "With thinking, we may be beside ourselves in a sane sense. By a conscious effort of the mind, we can stand aloof from actions and their consequences, and all things good and bad go by us like a torrent," end quote. This image of the unperturbed self is recognizably ataraxic, but the most compelling evidence of Thoreau's Hellenistic ascesis is his comportment toward death. Ado's spiritual exercise, melete thanatou, philosophy as a meditation for death. Prior to examining Thoreau's final months, I will first address the word ataraxia itself. Gisela Stryker's study, Ataraxia, Happiness is Tranquility, traces the Hellenistic term ataraxia, quote, literally freedom from trouble or anxiety, end quote, to Democritus's euthymia. The two words were used interchangeably until ataraxia, quote, became the favored term in Hellenistic times. The Latinate equivalent is tranquillitas. For both the Epicureans and Pyrrhonian skeptics, ataraxia is the highest good, though each school reaches it differently. Epicureans obtain it through katastematic, static pleasures in aponia, freedom from bodily pain, the durable goods that outrank kinetic pleasures, which, however genuine, remain bound to the cycle of want they temporarily relieve. Pyrrhonian skeptics, by contrast, obtain ataraxia through the suspension of all judgment, epoche. The Stoics, meanwhile, treat ataraxia, invoked especially by Epictetus, less as a systematic telos than the consequential mark of apatheia, the equanimity that attends a life lived according to virtue. For Epicurus, death is humanity's greatest fear, but it stems from a misunderstanding of nature, phusis. Since the soul is corporeal and dies with the body, death is, quote, nothing to us. And this deprivation argument dissolves the illusory dread that blocks katastematic pleasures, an ataraxia, freeing one to live hedonistically. The Stoics, while not naming ataraxia as their telos, pursue a parallel path through melete thanatou, the spiritual exercise of aligning the will with the logos by facing death as a rational necessity rather than an evil, treating death as an adiaphoron, an indifferent, strips it of ethical claim or power on the rational will, leaving the Stoic sage in a state functionally indistinguishable from ataraxia. Thoreau died from tuberculosis in 1862, though his first bout may have occurred as early as April 1836. In 1860, a severe cold, possibly contracted from Bronson-Elcott, was, quote, enough to ignite the slow-burning tuberculosis, end quote, docile walls, that would ultimately kill him. Given his family's history with the disease, he likely faced the prospect of dying from it for 26 years. Rumination about death may have been heightened in 1842 when his brother, John Jr., died on January 11th. Daniel Ricketts writes, quote, I never knew him to betray any tender emotion except on one occasion when he was narrating to me the death of his only brother John, end quote. In Three Roads Back, Richardson's language appears adocian when he observes that John's death transformed Thoreau's view of nature from, quote, a more or less conventional romantic approach to a profoundly felt emotional acceptance, not just an intellectual assent of death as an inescapable part of living, and an acceptance that at some level there is no death. The individual may die, but the materials composing the individual do not, end quote. This conviction, Richardson notes, quote, paradoxically becomes a powerful force for individual resilience, end quote, rather than despair. Thoreau does not ostensibly dwell on death in Walden. Yet his most direct statement on mortality comes in Where I Lived, in What I Lived For, when Thoreau famously writes that he went to the woods, quote, because I wished to live deliberately, and not when I came to die, discover I had not lived, end quote, making death the explicit horizon in which human flourishing is measured. Thoreau's keen awareness of his own mortality runs deep enough that some scholars have identified John's death as the catalyst behind Walden, in part considering that Thoreau moved to Walden to compose A Week on the Concord in Merrimack Rivers in homage to him. Audrey Radin reads A Week as a text in which, quote, the death of his beloved brother becomes a metaphor for all loss, and nature becomes both the repository of loss in the only fact Thoreau can turn to for both its realization and release, end quote. Thoreau's first book began in grief and matured into a narrative metabolizing loss through natural law that anticipates the ascesis Walden will complete. Whatever the psychological motivation, the Walden experiment is an exercise in conscious living according to nature, katafusin, premised on death as life's measure. As a conscious participant in the Hellenistic tradition of lived philosophy, Thoreau's Walden draws on both schools without contradiction. Hedonic immersion in nature and rational submission to its laws stand as twin expressions of his eclecticism. In solitude, his deliberateness in nature is Epicurean. Quote, this is a delicious evening when the whole body is one sense and imbibes every pore, end quote, a katastematic pleasure, the pleasure of aponia rather than appetite. In spring, it is stoic, quote, the individual part, in spring, it is stoic, no quote yet, the individual part is absorbed into the reason of the whole. As he looks upon a dead horse by his path, which, quote, compelled me to sometimes go out of my way, especially in the night, when the air was heavy, but the assurance it gave me of the strong appetite and inviolable health of nature, was the compensation for this. That pleasure and equanimity coexist even in nature's violence, that a dead horse can compensate rather than disturbed, anticipates the harder test of his ascesis, whether the same equanimity holds at his own deathbed. Lawrence Buell's brief essay, Thoreau's Death, offers the most comprehensive account of the testimonial record surrounding Thoreau's final months. Buell surveys the full range of deathbed reports while persuasively rejecting Walter Harding's explanation that tuberculosis chemically produced the composure, arguing instead that Thoreau's dying required, quote, great inner resources, end quote. When Parker Pillsbury, visiting Thoreau near his death, asked whether he had made his peace with God, Thoreau famously replied, quote, I did not know we had ever quarreled, end quote. Sam Staples told Emerson afterward that he had, quote, never seen a man dying with so much pleasure and peace, end quote. And in an April 7th letter to Ricketts, Sophia Thoreau wrote that, quote, Henry accepts this dispensation with such childlike trust and is so happy that I feel as if he were being translated rather than dying in the ordinary way of most mortals, end quote. By all accounts, Thoreau died a man whose anxiety was absent. Buell closes with a gesture toward the philosophical tradition, noting that, quote, if as Socrates and Cicero declared, and Montaigne reiterated, to philosophize is to learn to die, Thoreau seems to have done just that, end quote. But he stops short of naming the Hellenistic influences that make the philosophical parallel reasonable. This is the fruit that Ado and Svoboda never reach. Since neither essay extends beyond the pages of Walden, Thoreau's deathbed composure was the realized achievement of 20 years of ascesis, from the grief of 1842 through the Walden experiment, through the journals and beyond. Thoreau had been preparing, in the Adocian sense, for an end. His death was not literary performance or the numbness of illness, nor the conventional piety of the good Protestant death. Ataraxia for Thoreau was the solution to the problem of life, worked out, quote, practically rather than theoretically, end quote. This is what it meant in the end to be a philosopher. Thank you.
Okay, I'm William Homestead. My talk is on Thoreau and philosophy as a way of life, so there's going to be a little bit of overlap. I'm also going to talk about Pierre Hadot, but there's not too much overlap with Gary's paper. This talk is based on my essay, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Key Themes and Practices in Thoreau's Writings, which was recently published in Thoreau and Philosophy, edited by Marc Jolley and David Gordon, and the book is right up there by Marc. I never considered myself a philosopher, but a friend of mine who is an academic philosopher recommended two books to me that led me to think that maybe I am one. And those two books were Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life in 1995 and What is Ancient Philosophy in 2002. Hadot, who specialized in Neoplatonism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism, argued that philosophy as a way of life was fundamental to philosophical inquiry in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. He also wrote an essay on Thoreau. There are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers, which is a line from Walden. In that essay, Hadot states, we should remember the mode of life of Chinese, Hindu, Persian, and Greek philosophers, poor when it comes to external riches, rich when it comes to internal riches. He also quotes Thoreau and Walden, how can a man be a philosopher and not maintain his vital heat by better methods than other men? Such philosophers should be the ideal, but professors of philosophy may seek courtier-like worldly success rather than philosophy as a way of life. Hadot states that such professionalism leads one to be content with theoretical discourse that encourages rather than questions and counters living in an absurd manner. Hadot further states that Thoreau, by implication, suggests that he is a true philosopher and that his Walden life is living philosophy. We need few things to generate vital heat. The true philosopher is not fed, sheltered, clothed, and warmed like his contemporaries, Thoreau wrote in Walden. Hadot argues that Thoreau's Walden reflects both Epicurean and Stoic philosophy. He tapped into universal Epicureanism and Stoicism through spiritual exercises that result in a reduction of desires and an increase in simple pleasures, like the pleasure of existing, even though existence is inevitably mixed with suffering. Hadot states that Thoreau performed a philosophical act by living at Walden Pond. That act included an immensely enlarged perception of the world. Hadot, referencing Stoic philosophy, describes this perception as always perfectly aware not only of what he is doing, but also of what he is thinking, and of what he is, in other words, of his place in the cosmos. Hadot argues that we better understand Thoreau and his decision to live at Walden Pond by comparing him and the decision to philosophy as a way of life extolled by ancient philosophers. Philosophy was not just theory or love of wisdom, but love and wisdom in action. This mode of existing in the world is practiced in each instance, in each decision, in each response, with our most fitting responses guiding ourselves and others towards phusis, or radical transformation and growth. Philosophy as a way of life includes spiritual progress towards non-attachment and inner freedom, peace of mind, and cosmic consciousness, expressed as the rational soul living in harmony with the rational order of the cosmos. Wisdom cannot be fully attained, yet we may live our love and engage our whole being through spiritual exercises like intuitive contemplation, the perception of beauty, and dialogue. The rational soul engages in these exercises to stimulate our developmental capacity. For Hadot, Socrates is an exemplar of philosophy as a way of life. Socrates was a happy man, no matter his circumstance, and he taught equally with his words and presence. He knew silence and stillness well. Students often found him in a meditative posture, seemingly lost within himself. And he embodied a healthy non-attachment toward petty or superfluous things, leading him to live a contemplative life of few needs. It is no surprise that he also saw Thoreau's 2-month, and 2-day stay at his one-room house by Walden Pond as an exemplar of philosophy as a way of life, especially given Thoreau's declaration in Walden that the true philosopher loves wisdom by living according to its dictates and solving some of the problems of life. Such problems are interwoven with the transcendentalist version of transformation, self-culture, or cultivation of the soul. Thoreau was quite familiar with the spiritual exercises or practices of intuitive contemplation and perception of beauty, as well as dialogue. Contrary to mistaken myth, Thoreau was a townie, not a hermit, and his Walden house was 2 miles from Concord, Massachusetts, and near a road and popular fishing hole. Travelers were curious. What was he up to, giving up comforts for simple living? And that provided an opening for conversation. He wrote that he had more visitors when living in the woods than at any other time in his life, having 3 chairs, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, and 3 for society. We all know that quote. But time at Walden Pond also provided extra time for intuitive contemplation and perceiving beauty, and thus experiences of timelessness, as he revels in and has revelations of the sensuous and spiritual. His descriptions of the sensuous and spiritual illustrates one of many reasons to read Walden, as well as to read generally. For Thoreau, reading was a spiritual practice, or a noble endeavor elevating mind and spirit. His house at Walden Pond, he argued, was more conducive to reading than at a university, and thus we all need to find a place of solitude and begin to exercise, train like an athlete. Thoreau did not read just to read, but for spiritual insights that he could live. Reading is not a passive act, but a means for living love and wisdom. The practices and themes that I explore in my essay include the following, which are also section headings: sympathy with intelligence, which of course is a line from Walking; deep listening, which I've written out about in great length in my books, including an ecology of communication; wisdom traditions, self-reliance; virtue ethics, simplify, wilderness and wildness, the way of the naturalist, and civil disobedience. So there's a lot more that for your sake, I have left out. This is going to be about 13 minutes. I'm going to move to reading some portions of the conclusion from my essay in the philosophy and Thoreau and philosophy book. Hadot concluded his essay on Thoreau by stating that Walden cannot capture how he lived, both in its challenges and ecstasies, which are beyond words and thoughts. The philosophical act transcends the literary work that expresses it. By plunging into the heart of nature, Hadot stated that he explored its inexpressible contemplative and mystical aspects. He also stated that Thoreau himself makes this point when he wondered whether the facts most astounding and most real are never communicated by man to man. It is stardust caught, a segment of the rainbow which I have clutched. Thoreau's life was guided by the pursuit of wisdom, but wisdom is ultimately beyond words and thoughts, or stardust momentarily caught. For Hadot, those moments may be summed up as follows: we don't just study logic, we think and speak well. We don't just theorize about the physical world, we contemplate and harmonize with the cosmos. We don't just talk about morality, we embody virtues, enact moral judgment, and seek justice. A true philosopher expresses sage-like qualities based on the experience of inner states and how one is aligned with the cosmos in each moment of this precious life, including being aware of finitude, finding pleasure in being alive, living in the present to be happy, and expressing conscience. By this measure, Thoreau was a true philosopher. He explored key philosophical themes and enacted them in various spiritual practices. His writing was another practice. Still more practices include work, especially as a surveyor, community involvement, friendship and love, education and teaching, and a good death. Thoreau died young at 44 after many years of struggling with tuberculosis, but his lifetime of practices resulted in a good death. His sister Sophia, who cared for him, stated he had a childlike trust, as if he was being transported rather than dying in the ordinary way of most mortals. By this measure alone, he is a true philosopher. Perhaps Thoreau's most impressive and important skill was his prescience. Ancient philosophers prepared for death and provided insights humans would need in all ages to maintain their vital heat. But they could not have anticipated the techno-industrial capitalist postmodern world. The many gifts they did offer to later ages were due to tapping into the universal. Thoreau was expert at tapping into the universal, an expert at applying higher law to his times while being a seer and walking into futurity. The practices of living in sympathy with intelligence and deep listening led to prescience. Lawrence Buell wrote that Thoreau was an early diagnostician of the highly disrupted Anthropocene landscape due to his extensive investigation into the effects of the Billerica Dam on farming. He also studied changing landscapes on his boat trip with his brother John. Andrew Kopik wrote that he did not use the word capitalism, nor did his contemporaries, but he witnessed a market revolution of boom and bust cycles intrinsic to its inner workings that ran counter to democracy. He also felt its effects and questioned the economic, social, and ethical changes it wrought. Thoreau responded with his own revolution, decrying how economics socialized us out of our souls and celebrating how we might re-find an inner compass through simple and sustainable living. Thoreau not only anticipated the malady, but endeavored to share the cure. The age of global heating demands that we wake up and fittingly respond with our vital heat. Thoreau also knew the value of a living philosophy that included a positive vision of the future. Along with needed criticisms of early capitalist culture, he held up excellence and called on us to expect great things. In the conclusion of Walden, he wrote, "What youthful philosophers and experimenters we are! There is not one of my readers who has yet lived a whole human life. There may be but the spring months. These may be but the spring months in the life of the race." Let's hope so. Philosophy as a way of life may sound like a tepid rather than a forceful response to climate change and other related crises. But Hadot wrote that the philosopher aims to act upon souls and transform ways of seeing and living. Thoreau's living philosophy does not provide final answers, but it does gift us with an ongoing path of self-culture and simple riches that inspires not only contemplation, but also action. His writings and practices should act upon our souls, calling us to responsibility, engagement, and ultimately radical transformation of self and society. Emerson wrote that wisdom is living the greatest number of good hours. By this measure, few have been as consistently wise as Thoreau. This further confirms him as a true philosopher. "Let us spend one day as deliberately as nature," he wrote, "and not be thrown off the track by every nutshell and mosquito's wing that falls on the rails. Be it life or death, we crave only reality. If we are really dying, let us hear the rattle in our throats and feel cold in the extremities. If we are alive, let us go about our business." For Thoreau, good moments and good hours and good days are marked by finding our way to reality, to contact with unfolding spirit and unity and diversity as baseline reality. They are marked by embracing the far side of complexity and simple riches. They are marked by living deliberately so that we are less wrong. Thoreau, who struggled plenty and was not always disposed toward poetic or divine heights, lived and experienced them enough that his writings were sage-like philosophy as a way of life. Reading Thoreau in the right spirit is an invitation to transform. There is more day to dawn. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to mention the soul in this paper. And some of you are sitting there thinking, as when C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were in the Inklings meeting one night, and Tolkien is writing a new story and he wants to read some to them, and he mentions a character as being an elf. Another member of the committee speaks out, shouts out, "Oh, F, another elf." So here I go. You chose to be here. Each one of us has the same wish as everyone else. We wish to live a happy, healthy life. How does one achieve this happiness? How do we define happiness? While having one of his lengthy discussions with his friends, Socrates once said, "What is at stake is far from insignificant. It is how one should live their life." The question is perennially relevant, but there's more. The question is not just how do I live and be happy, or better, it is how do I flourish? We must begin with Aristotle, and I know y'all are tired of Aristotle by this point, but here we go again. For the past 16 years, I've been teaching ethics, and I always start off with Aristotle's Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, because he loved it so much he wrote 3 books of ethics. Rather than studying and discussing ethical questions and situations, which come up organically in the class, the focus of my class is on the cultivation of the soul, or the character of the student. I take this as the purpose of Aristotle's Ethics. Apparently taking his cue from Heraclitus, who came before him, who once said one's character is one's spirit, fate, destiny. Aristotle emphasized that it is not what one does or what one's intended purpose that counts, but rather what matters is who one is. In other words, as later moral theorists would have us think, all that matters, some would say, is what is the right action to do, what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, what is the best thing to do for them? The utilitarians say this. That's a very famous one and used a lot in legislation, by the way. Or maybe it's all for oneself, egotism. Or maybe should there be a universal correct action? That's like deontology and that great Kant guy. For Aristotle, one's character is the priority. For each one of us, our character needs to be cultivated by learning, practicing, and living by virtue. This leads to what Aristotle calls a divine presence or divine mind in us. And this is the life of flourishing. This is achieved by learning, practicing, living by virtues that have shaped one's soul, character, self, however you want to define it. The goal is that one's soul should become one with prudence. Now, prudence is a form of wisdom, but it's a practical wisdom. It's like a street wisdom, right? Prudence is that summation of Aristotle's program, because once you know who you are and you have prudence, here's what prudence means. It's practical wisdom that enables one, when facing any situation, you'll choose the correct action, you'll do it well, and you'll do it for the right reason. The person who has cultivated their soul lives and acts by their soul, their inner spirit, and not by ordinances or laws. For example, while the law may say you must turn in a fugitive slave, your cultivated soul refuses to because it's an unjust law. Aristotle writes, and this is a new translation, but you'll get the idea. Such a life is surely superhuman. That's to say, it is as a human being that you'll live a life like that. It's insofar as there exists something divine within you. We should transcend our mortality as much as possible and do everything we can to live our life by the very best element within us, that is the divine. It's also surely what you are, because it's part of what it's part of you that's in charge, the better part of you. So that means that for a human being, a life lived by the divine within you is the best and most pleasurable, since that's what a human being is most of all. So that's the form of life by which you're flourishing the most too, he says. What are the concept of eudaimonia? This is the word we usually translate as happiness. This is achieved as a person becomes a person of virtue, according to Aristotle. Such a person is happiest by living a life of virtue. Inner happiness is not Christmas morning. It's not birthday joy. It is the love of or total acceptance of one's virtuous self, hence the cultivated soul. Did Thoreau flourish? Did he achieve eudaimonia, inner happiness, total acceptance of himself? I think he did. When did it happen? It happened on the day he got married. That he got married is a certainty. When that happened is less certain. On August 21st, 1851, he writes in his journal, "It is the marriage of the soul with nature that makes the intellect fruitful and that gives birth to the imagination." Not unlike Kierkegaard, who was engaged for a year and a day and broke it off because he wanted to commit his life to being a writer. Not unlike Jane Austen, who said no one day later and gave her life to writing. There's something about this, right? Was it when he was 4 and he saw Walden for the first time? Was it when he read Emerson's Nature? Was it when Margaret told him his writing needed some help and refocus? Was it after his brother's death and he lay there sick, contemplating his future, his life? Was it when Ellen turned him down? It was certainly after that. Just when did this marriage take place? Was it at the time he spent with Erastus Brownson? Was it about later that summer when he put his first boat in the river? Or was it that time he spent with Charles Stearns Wheeler in Wheeler's cabin? Or was it when he moved to Walden Pond? Imagine the first night alone in that little house. He built with his own hands and with the hands of others. What did he really think about that first night? Was that his wedding night? We will never know exactly. Most likely it was a long engagement. Maybe he was not even aware that he had married nature until that journal entry of August 21st, 1851. Maybe he had merged with nature long before, and he just now faced the reality of the relationship. But the question is important. For most, I would think that the earlier transcendentalists had a real influence on him in his move towards nature. Or maybe it was when he was a student, reading Horace's epistles for Latin lessons. Wonderful, amazing things happen to students when they're translating an ancient text. Things happen, and there's no hard evidence for this, only circumstantial, for a suggestion I'm getting ready to make. As a professor who used to say, I have a sneaking suspicion. In 1836, Wheeler built a shanty and Thoreau stayed with him for a few weeks. We know the story. But where did this idea come from? Now, I checked with the former Thoreau, Richard Smith, and a couple of others, and people are still questioning where this idea came from, right? When Thoreau was a sophomore, so the curriculum suggests in Bob Saddlemeyer's book, he would have read and translated some of Horace's epistles and notes with Wheeler, the shanty guy, remember? What did these young men think and talk about when they or one of them read Horace's first epistle? And let me read a few lines from it, and you'll see where this is going. And this would have been in, I think it was 1834, 35. It's unclear when they would have done it. There's no record of when he read epistles, but it was on the curriculum. Horace writes, if we are meant to live in accordance with nature, and we are to begin by seeking a site for building a home, do you know any place to be preferred to the blessed countryside? Is there somewhere where winters are warmer, where a more pleasing breeze tames the madness of the dog star and the influence of the lion, so wild once it was received the piercing rays of the sun? Is there a place where envious care disrupts sleep less? Is the water that on city blocks, is that water purer than that which hurries along a downward stream? Of course, a forest can be cultivated amid many colored columns, and that house is praised which has a distant prospect of fields. But though you thrust nature out with a pitchfork, it always returns. The man who has been overpleased by fortune's favor will be shaken when it changes. Avoid great surroundings. In a humble house, you can surpass kings and kings' friends in living. End quote. I'm not suggesting that reading Horace converted Thoreau to the love of nature, although it would have encouraged him. I am suggesting simply Horace may have inspired Thoreau and Wheeler towards a house experiment. More relevantly to this paper, however, Thoreau does refer to Horace's odes in his writings, but my point is how Horace is read by anyone. He is a poet of contentment. He strived to live a life of eudaimonia, of contentment himself. Read him, give him a chance. I'm also suggesting that reading Horace helped Thoreau internally. Horace is known to inspire self-knowledge and contentment with life through nature, like Virgil did. Horace is widely regarded to be a poet to be read in search of a life of flourishing. Thoreau's marriage with nature, that is, relationship with nature, is where he fully cultivated his soul or his character. He found eudaimonia in nature. He held this idea through his entire life. In April 1861, he wrote to Parker Pillsbury, "Blessed are they who never read a newspaper, for they shall see nature, and through her God." Eudaimonia, the word for happiness, or better understood as flourishing. But that word is made up of two Greek words. The first is EU, for good, as in eulogy, for a good word. Second, daimon, as an inner spirit. When Socrates used it, it was an inner voice that he obeyed. Eudaimonia is a good inner spirit, a good divine presence within. Happiness is a good divine presence. Think about that. Hence the transcendentalist idea of the divinity within. In other words, if you claim to be a transcendentalist, then you are claiming to have a good inner divine presence. Recognizing this inner spirit, cultivating it, living in accordance with it is happiness. This is flourishing. So what does it mean to flourish? As Timothy Fuller wrote his daughter Sarah Margaret, mediocrity is obscurity. As Henry put it, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. We like to say that a lot around here. When I read Walden, I read his letters to, and when I read his letters to Blake, I'm reading the words of a man who was flourishing. Yes, Thoreau flourished. He was not mediocre. He was not living a life of desperation. He easily could have. Suffering the losses he had faced, the painful reminder of consumption, living in a society that enslaved humans, he could easily have turned sour and bitter, but he did not. As he told Blake in a letter of 6 December 1856, I am grateful for what I am and have. My thanksgiving is perpetual. It is surprising how contented one can be with nothing definite, only a sense of existence. I am grateful, he said, for what I am, how contented one can be only with a sense of existence. Thoreau did flourish. I read Walden as a witness, or if you prefer, a testimony to Thoreau's flourishing, to his own eudaimonia. And this is the end here. Consider a closing anecdote. We've already cited this a little bit. Here's another take on it. After her brother's death, Sophia wrote a letter to Daniel Ricketson. I feel as if something very beautiful has happened, not death, she writes. During his long illness, I never heard a murmur escape him or the slightest wish expressed to remain with us. His perfect contentment, she says, was truly wonderful. And without the slightest struggle, he left us at 9 o'clock. Sophia had also said in this letter, I can never be grateful enough for the gentle, easy exit which was granted to him. When I think of her words in his passing, it's almost as if he were in a boat on the Concord River. After all, good sailing depends on much more than the current of the river.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear that? Is that better? Okay. I want to begin by posing the simplest, most central question of all philosophy. How does one live a good life? There are many factors to consider, but my focus in this presentation is finding the balance between individual and collective well-being. The problem is simple. In today's world, it is remarkably difficult to feel personally fulfilled when there is so much chaos happening outside the self. Lucky for us, Thoreau also lived through tumultuous times and had to figure out how to strike this balance. Though he wasn't religious in the traditional sense, his unique way of worship deeply informed his search for fulfillment, helping him seek out individual well-being and also enabling him to meaningfully engage with the pressing issues of his time. In the Sunday chapter of his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, we get perhaps the clearest glimpse into Thoreau's elusive religious identity. He admits that, quote, in my pantheon, Pan still reigns in his pristine glory. Perhaps of all the gods of New England and of ancient Greece, I am most constant at his shrine, unquote. As a self-described worshiper of the god of the wild, it is no surprise that Thoreau's own form of worship revolved heavily around the natural world. This becomes increasingly clear as he documents his journey down the Concord River throughout the Lord's Day. Though he is far from society, he finds a community to worship with. The frogs that he observes are deep in meditation, thinking Sabbath thoughts about the, quote, wondrous universe in which they act their part, unquote. The fish swimming downstream beneath his canoe are likened to a school of staid and sober maidens heading to church. He waxes poetic about the burdock and catnip who came across the Atlantic with their settler counterparts, quote, they too seeking freedom to worship God in their way, unquote. In Thoreau's eyes, the river is not a simple waterway. Rather, it is a complex spiritual landscape populated with organisms who possess an intelligence and spirituality equal to his. Even the atmosphere itself is imbued with a spirit. Thoreau says, quote, the stillness was intense and almost conscious, as if it were a natural Sabbath, unquote. This idea of the natural Sabbath is central to what and how Thoreau worships. The here and now is transformed into the absolute ideal. The earthly conquered river becomes heaven, and the creatures swimming along it become fellow worshippers who, like Thoreau, see the beauty and the value of the world at hand. By building connections with the environment and its creatures through their shared observance of the natural Sabbath, Thoreau finds a sense of belonging that is essential for personal well-being. This lends itself well to the sense of respect and responsibility that Thoreau had towards the natural world. But if we look a little closer, it also informs his regard for the human world. Even during this peaceful, secluded river ride, Thoreau's thoughts return to the happenings of society. He considers how the actions of mankind are impacted by worship. Criticizing the more traditional Christian idea of heaven as a separate and faraway place, Thoreau says, quote, Jesus taught mankind but imperfectly how to live. His thoughts were all directed toward another world. There is another kind of success than his. Even here, we have a sort of living to get. There are various tough problems yet to solve, and we must make shift to live between spirit and matter such a human life as we can, unquote. It is here that the natural Sabbath transforms from a poetic, pastoral anecdote into an urgent call to action. Thoreau reminds us that it matters greatly where our heaven is located in relation to ourselves. If our sights are set on an eventual paradise rather than the here and now, how can we be called to address the tough problems that have yet to be solved? How can we be called to actively participate in improving our world if it is nothing but a stepping stone towards heaven? Under the framework of the natural Sabbath, on the other hand, there is no separation between heaven and earth. This is it. This is what we have been given, and once we become aware of the immense value of our world, it becomes our responsibility to uphold this goodness. It becomes our responsibility to solve the tough problems. Whereas traditional religious views often provide a heavenly escape from suffering and injustice, Thoreau's natural Sabbath requires action. This is evident in Thoreau's own response to the pressing issues of his time. As much as he loved contemplating alone in nature, he always eventually emerged from these woodland reveries back into society. He cared deeply about the well-being of his fellow man and was a staunch abolitionist who did more than simply lament the cruelty of slavery. He took action by refusing to pay his taxes in protest, mobilizing others to do the same. Although he faced jail time, this action was the natural path as an observer of the natural Sabbath. Having found an earthly heaven through his way of worship, Thoreau understood that he was part of something valuable. His kinship with the smaller members of his world, like the frogs and the grasses, provided a sense of belonging, but more importantly, provided a powerful framework of universal respect and responsibility towards others. This guided his reactions to injustices committed against his fellow man. Without hesitation, he knew that tangible action against injustice was the right path. This is precisely why Thoreau's way of worship was so instrumental in his search for the good life. it took care of his individual spiritual needs, while also enabling him to meaningfully contribute to the collective well-being of the community. During times of strife, it is especially crucial to take care of oneself while also actively participating in the betterment of one's world. We simply cannot succeed in living a good life without striking this balance. I would venture to say that in this current moment in history, many of us find it difficult to do this. When we witness polarization, misinformation, and brutalization, we often initially react with outrage. We know that things aren't meant to be this way. We reject it. But when it comes time to act against it, we tend to lose that impetus. We withdraw into our own worlds, becoming exhausted by a sense of powerlessness. We retreat, assuming that we'll find more peace if we simply avoid the chaos. But we have to remind ourselves that retreating is not the answer. We will always fail to find true fulfillment when we isolate ourselves from a world that we belong to. Thoreau did not live a good life because he ran away to the woods. He lived a good life because he engaged with the world in such a profound way that allowed him to find his purpose as both an individual and as a member of a larger community. As Thoreau's Natural Sabbath demonstrates, living a good life means cultivating connection, because connection leads to belonging and drives meaningful action. Connections become reasons to invest in the well-being of our world, which is inextricably linked to the well-being of our individual selves. So, what could this look like? Some of you may feel that in 2026, we have bigger things to focus on than nurturing our connection to the natural world. But I argue that right now it is critically important to reground ourselves in a practice of mutual care and stewardship. Observing the natural Sabbath simply means taking the time to see the worthiness of our world. The simple act can snowball into something much more significant, and to prove it, I will end by telling you a story about a single bumblebee. I'm an environmental educator, so I spend a lot of my time teaching students about why they should care about nature and, by extension, the world as a whole. The idea here is that big change starts small. Children who learn that it is important to protect bees are apt to extend that principle to other living things. I recently planted a pollinator garden with a bunch of elementary schoolers in South Providence, and to my great joy, these students already cared about bees. They had learned about pollination in the fall, and not long after, one student happened to find a fatigued bumblebee on the blacktop. Of course, there was a lot of deliberation about what to do with it. Some kids wanted to squish it, but others intervened and convinced their classmates to make a better choice. They moved it to a safe place, gave it some sugar water, and lovingly named it Buzzley. When Buzzley passed away, he was buried in the playground. Would you believe that these students had independently figured out how to observe the natural Sabbath? When they connected with Buzzley, they saw him not as a mere insect, but as a peer who deserves respect and protection. Importantly, they let this connection guide their action. They dedicated our pollinator garden to their fallen friend, remembering his fighting spirit and what he meant to them. It was not a chore to get their hands dirty and even encounter some slimy earthworms. Rather, it was the natural thing to do. Through Buzzley, they connected with the world outside of themselves and saw its worth, and this was the way to give back. It was an act of care that reflected back upon their individual selves. The students had identified something real to be good for, and this allowed them to find joy, purpose, and pride in taking this action. So, when I implore you to observe the natural Sabbath, I'm not suggesting that we all go out on canoes together and sing hymns on the river, although that would probably be lovely. All I ask is that you look out beyond yourselves and build a connection to anything whose spirit catches your eye. Let this spirit fill you with the warmth of unspoken kinship. And remember this warmth when it comes time to take action in order to preserve the goodness that undoubtedly exists. Though this action may be difficult, it is not cause for despair. It is cause for joy because it is a gift to be able to participate as long as we believe that this world is worth participating in. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for what, 10 minutes? Questions? I don't know if anyone noticed, but Josephine was on her tippy toes that entire time. I was so impressed.
Thank you, all of you. I thought this was like so incredibly timely, and what a great way to spend the afternoon. But I have a question for Josephine. I really love the Buzzley story. Really just like when you think about flourishing and teaching young people to flourish. But I have a question. So I'm also an educator, and I feel like we're just up against so much right now with social media and like shrinking in attention spans. And so it sounds like you work with younger people, but I don't know, what did that look like when you got them to focus on the bee, and also like what particular challenges did you face and how might you do it differently, thinking about Thoreau's flourishing and, you know, the natural Sabbath? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that for young people especially, and older students as well, I feel like, especially for students that grow up in urban areas, they're not introduced to nature as much as many of us were in our childhoods, and with the unfamiliarity that comes with a fear. It comes with a fear of bees, which is valid. You know, bees do sting. So there was apprehension on that front, but I think when they got to meet Buzzley up close because he couldn't fly and because he was injured, that allowed them to take a closer look at what this creature was, how it acted, what it looked like, where it belonged in the world, what it was meant to do. So I would say for environmental education, one of the biggest things is just getting kids out in nature and not necessarily expecting them to come away with a really profound understanding of their place in it or you know, a profound love for it right away, but just building up those experiences so that by the end of the day they'll have one more positive experience with nature, so that can reduce some of the fear and the apprehension that they may have towards these situations.
Thank you.
Uh, I was impressed by the fact you said that Aristotle, fulfilled life is that living the divine life within, and you mentioned that for Thoreau that was closest to nature. Could you kindly expand a little bit? Something I vaguely remember that was it St. Thomas Aquinas was the one for whom Aristotle was translated. I think it was into Latin, and it was the basis of his very influential, I think it was philosopher. I think I'm getting that right. Could you expand upon that? Maybe the influence of Aristotle on Thomas Aquinas as an example of the divine life.
Yeah, I think there's a connection there. Aristotle was revived in the Middle Ages. We call them the Middle Ages, whatever you want to call them. And it is very important to Aquinas and the development of, you know, Aquinas wrote a book on the virtues, and that was a very important part. And Dante comes along right after that and writes about the 7 virtues and the 7 deadly sins. But that Aristotle influence is very important to Aquinas and others. And in this time period, around 1,000 to 1,300. There was a very unique coming together of Jews, Muslims, and Christians in preserving, especially from the Islam community, preserving Aristotle's writings. Then they soon got translated into Latin. And interestingly, the, the work on logic, which is the most dense and most difficult of all of Aristotle's writings, was the most popular thing going for a while. But yes, Aristotle was very important to Aquinas and the development of those ideas in the Middle Ages of the church.
Thank you all. This was a really great panel, and I want to pick your brain later, maybe William, on kind of realizing that the philosophical approach is interesting and worth pursuing with Thoreau and like the philosophical life. I found that really interesting. But I have a question for Josephine because I'm thinking about a couple classes that I'm going to teach for college students, right? So a little bit older, I think, than the folks you're working with. But this idea of a natural Sabbath is really interesting to me. And when I think about Sabbath, and there's many ways to think about this, I suppose, but I'm sort of torn between a secular understanding where Sabbath is rest, right? Like the idea here is to engage with something differently, but also not to labor, right? And on the other hand, maybe in a more conventionally religious Christian sense, it's like a sacrament, right? You know, participation, observation of the Sabbath. And I guess I want to invite you to think about those two differences and think about like, how would this fit into, so like I teach environmental writing, but whatever class, like, is this a moment of rest from the rest of our curriculum where we just let the world unfold and see what happens and kind of go from there? Or is this a moment where we're observing something and plugging in and connecting? And I hope you see that like what I'm saying is like these are two kind of different understandings of what a Sabbath is and what it's good for, right? So
yeah, no, I've run into that not problem, but that problem in my own approach to learning more about nature. Because I'm not a naturalist by training, so I've also had to sort of learn on the job because I'm teaching these students, but also teaching myself about nature. So on the one hand, there's part of me that wants to sort of make it like work and like go out there with a field guide and identify every single thing that I see. But ultimately, that's not what allows you to make the connections that make nature important to you. So yeah, it's a fine line because some of it is scientific and some of it is like work. And it shouldn't, in my opinion, just being outside and, you know, looking at the sky isn't going to help you build those connections between yourself and all the smaller things. But I think it's more about the intentionality of it and going outside, knowing that you're going to approach things that you are unfamiliar with, that you don't know about, and maybe in that moment it'll feel right to learn more about them and to put in that work, but it may also feel right to just exist alongside that thing with the understanding that you're both living lives that are as important as each other's lives, even though it may not seem that way. Yeah, it's kind of a long game. It takes a while to build those connections and understand the ecosystem that we're living in if we're not engaging with it very regularly. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it goes back and forth between it being work and it being like a devotional sort of thing.
I'm gonna just add on to the question because I taught a course, a college level course for many, many years called The Voice of Nature. And one of the best assignments I had them do was to go out and write a field note of some species, but I tried to integrate the scientific with the spiritual. So I said, go out into nature and be open to exploring what species might speak to you. You know, don't go out to find, don't decide on your species ahead of time. Go out and be open to what comes to you. And I see that as a form of listening. And so once they did that, then they sat down and then they had the kind of Sabbath experience of being very quiet and being mindful and being with the species. And then eventually write down every detail you could possibly notice, and then go back and do the research. And then you teach creative writing, then turn it into a creative field note, not just like a scientific field note, but one with creative writing, but also scientific insights and concepts and things like that. I had a mentor who wrote science poetry, so I'm always influenced in the integrating the sciences and humanities, and I try to help students do that as well. So that might be a good aside.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask Gary, but this is an opportunity to ask, I guess, 5 philosophers. Gary, you mentioned Marcus Aurelius, but nowhere in Walden is there any credit or indication, and I don't know the journals, but there doesn't seem any indication that Henry says some of these ideas have come to him from Marcus.
Richardson states that we do not know if Thoreau had actually read Marcus Aurelius. A very popular translation came out in 1862, the year that Thoreau died. However, Emerson alluded to Marcus Aurelius, and he was certainly in the intellectual ether. We can assume that Thoreau read Marcus Aurelius based on his knowledge of the classics. I don't know if you've ever read the section reading in Walden, but he certainly emphasizes reading classical literature in its own language. I would be willing to bet that he most certainly read Marcus Aurelius. But it's not as evidential as some of the other writers that I referenced, some of the other classical writers.
There was a wonderful book written, I think, a number of years ago now. I can't remember the exact title, but it was like Thoreau Among the Classics. And it examines, you know, his background in classical, reading classical literature. So he was steeped in Roman and Greek classics, whether he read Marcus Aurelius or not. I think the whole outlook, milieu that he lived in was, I don't know, entirely defined by his classical background. But, you know, if Christianity had never come along, our ethics would be based on according to nature. I mean, that's a theme throughout classical philosophy, live according to nature. And we get confused, I think, when Christianity comes along, because then it's like live according to the Bible, or live according to the teachings of the church, or live according to teachings of Jesus. Not that I dispute the teaching of Jesus, but our ethics would be very different, I think, if Christianity never come along. And I think